Hi, and welcome to IV Tutor. We are looking at the Memento Design Pattern today. All right, so of all the design patterns that we have looked at, I think this is the most complicated one that most of you guys find very confusing because it's got 3 classes and there's a lot going on with this design pattern. So basically, you use the Memento Design Pattern whenever you are trying to implement a backup facility or if you want to enable rolling back, so that if something changes, you can always revert to the previous state. That is when you use the Memento Design Pattern. And in most cases, I think as you see in the questions, it's mostly compared with the serializer design pattern, but these are 2 different things, okay? So with the Memento Design Pattern, there are 3 classes involved. You've got the originator, the memento, and the caretaker. So obviously the word memento, from the English meaning, something you keep for your remembrance. That is exactly what you use it for in this design pattern. It remembers your state. So if we go back to here, you guys must read through all of this stuff. I won't explain. This is very straightforward, but I'll try and explain the most important bits of this question as we look at more questions. So there are 3 classes involved in the Memento Design Pattern, which is your originator, your memento, and your caretaker. And these 3 classes are representing responsibilities, which means when you apply this design pattern, doesn't mean that all your classes will always be called originator, memento, and caretaker. In the actual context, these may have different names. As you will see, we're going to look at 2 different questions on past exams. Especially, I like this one because it's very confusing for most of you. So we'll come back to it. But the 3 classes involved in the Memento Design Pattern are the originator, the memento, and the caretaker. You are very less likely going to have a question that wants you to apply the UMO class diagram to illustrate that you understand memento. It's unlike the factory method design pattern. So the UMO class diagram here just explains what is involved in the originator, what do you do in the memento, and what do you do in the caretaker. And I'll try and break it down for you before we can look at questions. So every time you see a question on Memento Design Pattern, the first thing you want to do is to identify these 3 classes. Which one is your originator, which one is your memento, and which one is your caretaker. Now, we say you use the memento whenever you want to preserve the state of your object. So the object whose state you're trying to preserve, or the one you want to back up, or the one you want to be able to roll back, is your originator. In other words, it's the original object that you need to back up. So whenever you are trying to apply this design pattern, the first thing you want to do is to identify which one is my originator. And if you're provided with more classes, then which one is my memento? You're going to get very few questions, if at all, on the caretaker. And you'll see why. So whenever we talk about the state of a class, basically it means everything under private. Because functions don't keep values, they process values. But your data members, which are sitting under private, are the ones that represent your state. So if we look, for example, at this class here that we have, the book list class, we'll use this in the next example. It means when we talk about the state of the book list class, is this thing here. Whatever is under private. It doesn't have to be a queue list. It can be a queue string, it can be an integer, and it can be more than one item. So whatever is under private, that is what we're referring to as the state of your object or of your class. The state of your class is what's going to change. And it's what we need to preserve and be able to roll back. So if we look at this question here on the screen, you are given the book list class, and they say, modify this class and its implementation file so that it implements a backup facility. There's no other part in this whole course where you talk about a backup facility and it's not Memento. So there's no confusion there. The moment you see a question asking you about a backup facility or rolling back functionality, you know you are dealing with the Memento Design Pattern. So if we come back here, here's our class, which means this class here is representing our originator. And what we see under private here is what we are referring to as the state of the class. To make sure that you understand the 3 classes involved and how you use them, I'm going to illustrate how you use these three classes, let's say in your main function. And then we'll come back and talk about what kind of modifications do you do in each of these three classes. What do you do in the originator class? What do you do in the memento? And what do you do in the caretaker? But for us to understand what we are doing, you have to understand how you need to use each of the functions in each of these three classes, right? So how do you back up? And how then do you restore, given these three classes, all right? And before we do that, let's understand the responsibilities of these three classes. We said the originator is what you need to back up. It is the one with the state that you need to preserve. Now, a memento is simply a class that keeps that state for you. In other words, a memento is simply saying, if you want to back up your current state, make an instance of me. The state can continue to change, but this one will stay the same because no one is touching this. So a memento is simply an instance that keeps the value or the current value of originator at that point in time. The originator can continue to change and get new values, but the memento will remain the same because it's a point in time instance. It keeps the value that you gave it at a certain point in time, which means when you then want to restore, you can extract your value from the memento and then restore to the originator. That is how these two classes work together. So for us to understand the three responsibilities of these three classes, you want to know how you use them. So before we talk about, oh, that's how you do the memento, that's how you do the originator, that's how you do the caretaker, let's just illustrate how do I use these three classes together once I have them. Okay. The last class we haven't really talked about yet is the caretaker. And the responsibility of the caretaker is to keep these mementos, right? It keeps a list of your backups, for instance. So let's illustrate this code here. Let's say you've got a class called originator. I'm going to use the original classes of this design pattern so that we can understand the responsibilities of each class, and then we'll come back and apply context. So if you start, let's say this is in your main function or in your widget or in your view, wherever your client, this is where this is happening. And in here, you're going to make an instance of an originator. So let's say you've got your originator here, O, for instance, and you go O.set state, you set some value, you give it whatever you give it, the state has changed, and then you want to back it up. So to back up your originator, you're going to call a function that creates the backup for you. So, and that backup is what we're referring to as the memento. The memento is what keeps the state of your class at that point in time. So we can then go here, memento, M, for instance, equals originator, or I can use O dot create memento. So this is now creating the backup, and you get an instance of a memento, right? And once you've got this instance of a memento, your originator can continue to change. You can then go O.set state. So your originator can change O.set state. Now it's got a new value. This can keep on changing, and things will happen. The value will change. And then you can then say, look, I want to back up my originator again, right? So in this case, you can say, oh, let's back this up again. So let's go memento. Let's go this backup 2 equals O.create memento. And there, that's a backup. But where do you keep these mementos? Where do you keep these backups? That is where the caretaker comes into play. So your caretaker is simply a class that is there to take care of your mementos. In other words, a caretaker is simply a list of mementos. So you can make a class here or instance of a caretaker. Let's call this one C, which means every time you are creating a memento, you want to store this one in the caretaker. So you can do something like C.append M. So your caretaker is a list. That's why you see here I'm calling the append function, right? I'm simply saying add this memento to my caretaker. And here I can make another backup, which is your memento, and I can also go C.append, then I put M2 here. So your caretaker will continue to have new values of your mementos as you create them. That's how it works. You keep on creating new mementos, you keep on backing them up, you keep on storing them. That's how these two classes work together. Now let's talk about I want to restore. Something goes wrong here. All dot delete all, and then everything is gone, whatever is happening in this class. And then you are like, oh, let me restore to the original state that I had. In that case, what do? You have to go and get your backup. Where do you get it from? You go to your caretaker, which is a list, and you say, please give me back my memento or my backup. So you can go and then say, memento, let's go this one, M3, and then we go equals C, maybe at index number 0. Because remember, this is a list, right? Or C dot at 0. Since it's a queue list, right? Let's say, assuming that it's a queue list, we can then do something like this. This means give me that memento that I gave you that you have at index number 0. So that's how you can get your memento back from the caretaker, right? And then you can restore. And to restore, you go back to your originator, then you call the set memento function, which is equivalent of your restore function. In other words, it will look like this. So here I've used the original functions as they exist inside your originator, which is your set memento and your create memento, right? But let's add some context to this. Let's say we are dealing with this class called book list, which is what we want to use and deal with. So what's going to happen in this case is you're going to say, well, look, I've got originator in this case, which is your book list. So this here is your book list, which is the original class that you want to backup. The memento, we can call this class backup. This is the backup. And the caretaker, we can call this one a backup list, which is a list of your backups. So if I put some context, these could be the 3 names of our classes, right? And if we go through the same illustration that we did, like how would you use these 3 classes together? It would look something like this, right? You would go, I have an instance of a book list, list, and you can you can add a new book. Maybe you add a new book here and things happen. And then you can say, I want to back up my book list. So you create an instance of a backup, which is your memento. Let's call this one B. And then you can go list.create backup. Now, this function is equivalent to the create memento function because it is the function that creates the backup for you. It creates the memento for you. So if you go here, you are going to then want to store your backup somewhere in your caretaker. And what is your caretaker? Your caretaker is your book list, your backup list, I mean. So you can have an instance here of a backup list. Let's call this one B list, which is a list of our backups. So you can then store your backup in your backup list. So you can go B list dot append, then we go append your backup, which is B, right? And then after that, your book list can continue to change. Let's say you add more books, add book here, and then you do that, and then you go list dot add more books, like that, and then you can say, oh, I want to back up again. Again, you create a memento, right? And I can do this on one line. I can do something like book list dot append. Then I get my backup from just calling list dot create backup, for instance. I've just done this on one line, right? But it's equivalent of the 2 lines I've used before. I'm getting a backup from my originator and appending it to my backup list. So that's how you create mementos and you store them. In this case, I'm using just the originator I'm using the caretaker and the originator to create my backups and store my backups. Then from here, I can then do something like, well, now something goes wrong somewhere here, and then you want to restore. What do? You've got to go and get a backup. Let's say R to restore. Let's get this backup from our backup list, which is our caretaker, and let's get the first one. And then to restore, we can then go back to our originator and then call the restore function. And then we give this function our backup, which is R, and then it's done. So in this case, I've added some context to the Memento design pattern, but we can actually identify that this here is our originator, this is our caretaker, this is our memento, this is our create memento function, this is our set memento function. So the main 2 things I want you to take note of is that your originator is the one responsible for creating the memento, and it's the one responsible for restoring from the memento. So your originator is the one that creates the backup, and it's the one that restores from the backup. All right, so that is how you would use these three classes together to apply the Memento Design Pattern to actually create a backup and restore from your backup, including storing those backups in your caretaker. That is where you store the backups, okay? That is where you store the backups. So going back to the original UMO class diagram that we are looking at for the Memento Design Pattern, we are saying that in your originator, there are only two things that need to happen. You need two functions, one to create the backup and one to restore from the backup, which is a memento, right? That's how easy it is. That's what happens in the originator every single time. Your memento is simply a class that is there to preserve your state. I'll come back to this one. And your caretaker is simply a class that is there to store your mementos. In other words, a caretaker is simply a list of this class, right? So if we go back to the memento, how would you create a memento? Let's use our backup, our book list class as an example of these two things, these three things that we need to apply, okay? So if we go here, here's our book list class. For you to be able to create a memento, the first thing to identify is your state, because your memento class is nothing more than the state that you need to preserve. It's simply a class that says, I can keep this state for you. So what you do here is you go, okay, let's write the memento class here. Let's go. Here's my class. Here's my memento class. I'm going to call this one backup, right? Because you can give these classes any names you want. And I'm saying in this class, the most critical things to identify is that it's going to store whatever state you need to preserve. If it's a queue list of book, that is what you need to store in your memento. I can call this one state or anything you want to call it. And that is all that goes in your memento class. So whatever state you have in your originator, that is what you want to include in your memento. Whatever is under private, if it's two variables, those two, if it's three variables, those three, if it's one, that one, right? If there's nothing under private here, then there's nothing to preserve. There's no state to preserve. But if there is at least one thing, that state that you have in your class, you want to have another class that can keep it for you, that can keep the current value of this for you. Which means inside this class, you don't need anything else complicated. It's just going to be a get function and a set function. So I can say, I can have a queue list of type book here, and I can call this one get state. And you don't even need to call it get state. I can call it get book list or something that I'm going to use the state to cement that idea that I'm just keeping the state for another class. And we can have another class void, let's call this one set state, which is going to get a queue list of type book, and let's call this B, and that's it. So these are the two things that you have in your memento class. So you can see it's one of the simplest classes you will ever write because it only has two things, a get and a set function for the value that you want to keep, okay? And your caretaker is the simplest of all these three because a caretaker is simply a list of your mementos. So if I go class here, if I, let's say, call this one backup list, for instance, I can just inherit from a queue list of type backup, and my class is done. That's all I need to do. That's my caretaker taken care of, done. So let's come back to the memento class, this one. I don't need to explain how to implement this, do I? It's a get state function. It returns this. This one is a set state function. It receives a queue list and applies it to your state. Okay? Then your originator needs to change because your originator is responsible for creating the backup and restoring from the backup, which means in your originator, you need to introduce two functions. I'm going to rewrite this class quickly so that you can have everything on one page and make it easy to reference, right? So we've got these two classes here. So my originator is simply a class, right? Book list. I'm going to ignore everything in this class and focus only on what matters, right? Under private here, we've got our book list, a queue list of type book. I think it's called list. And under public, inside your book list, you need to introduce two functions. All the other functions in this class do not change. It remains exactly the same. We need to introduce one to create the memento. In other words, one to create the backup. So you can then have a class that returns a backup, and we can call this one, maybe you can just call this one create backup, for instance, right? And another one to restore from the backup. So you can call this one void restore. And then this one takes a backup B, for instance. These are the only two changes you need to introduce in your originator. One to create the backup and one to restore from the backup. So if we go to our illustration that we did before, these are the two functions. They want to create the backup, which returns the backup, and they want to restore from the backup when you need to backup. So these are the two functions you need to introduce inside your originator. One to return the backup and one to restore from the backup. And if we are to implement these two functions inside our originator, they're actually very simple because we need to create a backup and we need to restore. And your backup class looks like this, which is very simple. It simply says, give me a state, and that's it, and you return it. So if we look at the create backup function, if we need to implement this function, it's going to look something like this. It returns a backup. It's in the book list class, and it's called backup, right? And what do you do in this class? You make an, it's called create backup, sorry. We call this one create backup. And in here, we're going to make an instance of a backup, B. We're going to call b.set state. We give it our list, which is under private, and we return B. The code involved in this whole design pattern is actually very simple. There's no complicated code or complicated syntax. It's the logic you need to get right. The actual code involved throughout these classes is very simple. You're not doing anything complicated. Let's talk about implementing the restore function, right? It's a void function, book list, restore. The restore function needs you to give it a backup. What do? All you do is you access your state in B and you assign it back to list. So you're going to list equals B.get state, or whatever your get function is in your book list. And that's it. That's how you restore. Because you are saying, I kept the value of lists at a particular point in time inside a value that I've stored in B. So get that value, reassign it to list, and you have restored. That is how you implement these two functions. So they are very simple functions to implement. Create backup, make an instance of a backup, set your state, and return the backup. The set state function that I'm using here is the one that is here. Void set state, you give it a queue list of books, and it obviously takes this and assigns it here. And it's an instance, you then keep it somewhere, which means the logic of keeping the states is not included in your originator. That logic is part of when you start using these classes to actually back up something and restore. That is when you then need to use the caretaker, and you must be able to explain this logic. I've seen a question that said, without writing any code, explain how the Memento design pattern works, or how you would use those three classes. And in that question, all you have to do is like, look, I have to make an instance of my originator and an instance of my caretaker. Right? I create a backup, or I create a memento using the originator, and I store that memento inside my caretaker. For me to restore, I go and get the memento from the caretaker, and I use the restore function or the set memento function of my originator to restore the state. You are simply explaining these steps. So in other words, it's actually important to understand how these three functions are used together. But what we're talking about here is how do you implement the functions that you need for you to be able to use these classes to backup and restore. And we are saying in the originator, you only need to introduce two functions. They want to create the memento and they want to restore. And the actual memento class is very simple because it's simply a class with the state that you need to keep on behalf of book list with a get and a set function. And there's a caretaker, which is simply a list of your mementos. That is how these three classes work together. And if we reference the original UMO class diagram, you will see what I'm talking about. Here's your memento class. Your originator has two functions. They want to create the memento and they want to restore from the memento. Your memento class is simply a class that preserves the state for you. So whatever this is as well, with a get and a set function. And your caretaker is simply one that keeps a list of these guys. Right. Now, the last and final thing that you should understand about the Memento Design Pattern is that the caretaker must not be able to modify the state of the backups that it keeps. In other words, the caretaker must be nothing more than a caretaker, right? So as it stands, it's possible for us to add code inside our backup list that can get the state of the backup, change it using the set state function, and still keep it. But the requirements of the design pattern state that the caretaker mustn't be able to touch any of these backups. Which means if we try to add code inside our backup list to modify these backups, it should not be possible. It should break because that violates what are referred to as the encapsulation requirements of the design pattern. The encapsulation requirements of the design pattern. Excuse me, all right? So the encapsulation requirements of the Memento Design Pattern state that your caretaker must not have access to the state of the backups that it's storing. Now, for us to achieve this requirement, what we have to do is we simply need to make everything private inside the Memento class. Once everything is private, it means that your caretaker can no longer be able to call the get state function or the set state function. It has no access to the state of the backups that it's keeping here. So then it becomes impossible for this backup list class to touch this state here. In other words, it simply becomes nothing more than a caretaker. But by introducing this change, we have also created a new problem, which is inside your book list. How then are we going to be able to call the set state function and the get state function now that it's private? So it solves the problem for backup list, but introduces a problem for book list. Now, to solve the problem for book list, what you then do is you make book list a friend of backup. So in other words, you say, well, friend class book list. When you make a class a friend of another class, it has access to everything under private. So this way, it means that your book list is able to access all these functions, even though they are private, but your backup list or any other class cannot. And when you have done it like this, you have fully applied the Memento Design Pattern. So a quick recap. When applying the Memento Design Pattern, there are two things to remember, or three things to remember. Number one, so the basic two things to remember are, how do I apply the Memento Design Pattern in terms of implementing or providing your Memento class and making changes to your book list or to your originator class? And secondly, how do I use these three classes together? Do you understand how they work together to create a backup and restore and all of that, right? Now, when it comes to applying the Memento Design Pattern, you have to understand these basic things. Number one, in the originator, you're only making two changes. Introduce two functions. Whatever is there in that class, you don't touch. It doesn't change. Introduce your two functions and you are fine. Then introduce your Memento class. And your Memento class has nothing but the state that you need to preserve. And get and the set function, everything must be private, and your originator must be a friend of your Memento class in order to meet the encapsulation requirements of the Memento Design Pattern. And lastly, you should be able to understand what your caretaker is, and your caretaker is nothing but a list of your backups, which means it's the simplest of all these three classes. This summarizes the Memento Design Pattern, and next up, we need to look at a few examples using past exam type questions on how to answer questions on the Memento Design Pattern. How do you identify, how do you know that this question is about Memento? How do you identify the responsibilities of these three classes given some context, like a book list class? Or let's look at a few questions and identify and find out how you apply the Memento Design Pattern in an exam setup. Right, I'll see you in the next video.